I'm Mia Walker. I'm 41 years old, and 2 weeks ago, I was zip-tied in front of my little brother's $4 million mansion while he shouted to the police that I was dealing drugs. The same brother who once gave me his last slice of birthday cake when we were kids was now pacing barefoot across his manicured lawn, pointing fingers and listing every way I'd supposedly ruined my life. I remember the moment like it's tattooed behind my eyelids. The sun was too bright for that hour of the morning. The air smelled like citrus from the landscaping crew that had just left, and my wrists were burning from the cheap plastic ties that dug into my skin. I stood still on the pavement, surrounded by 2 officers, while Luke paced like a man who'd rehearsed this moment in front of a mirror. "She's been unstable for months," he told them. "Lost her job, lives in a dumpy apartment. I found white powder in her coat pocket. What more do you need?" He was calm, deliberate, and that was the part that broke me the most. There was no confusion in his voice, no concern, no hesitation, just strategy. 20 years of silence, of letting my family believe I was a drifter, an embarrassment, a problem no one wanted to deal with, and this was how it all came to a head. In front of neighbors I didn't recognize, but who probably knew my brother's wine collection better than I knew his kids. I wasn't even surprised when Officer Martinez asked me to sit down on the curb. I just did it because sometimes it's easier to let things play out. That's something you learn when you've spent your life undercover. Luke's voice cut through the silence again. "She's 41 and has never had a real job. Never married. Never even made rent without help." I turned my head slightly, not enough to make it look defiant, just enough to see him clearly. His expensive watch glinted in the sunlight, like a prop in a bad play. He'd waited for this moment, or maybe created it. Ever since our dad passed and left us equal shares of the estate, Luke had been building his case. Mia is unstable. Mia can't manage money. Mia should be declared incompetent. And here he was, sealing the final act with a performance so smooth, I almost clapped. But here's the thing. I wasn't the woman he described. And the white powder he found? It wasn't what he thought it was. The truth was sitting 3 blocks away in a black van filled with federal surveillance equipment. The truth was about to rewrite everything Luke thought he knew about me. And for the first time in 2 decades, I didn't need to hide it anymore. For 20 years, I lived like a ghost. Not the kind that haunts people, but the kind that slips through rooms unnoticed, leaving just enough of a trace to remind everyone she exists, but never enough to explain why. I let them think I was a disappointment, because that was safer than the truth. I joined the DEA right out of college, recruited from a chemistry program I never told anyone I'd even enrolled in. While my family assumed I was flunking community classes and couch surfing, I was in Quantico learning how to dismantle cartel networks and fake identities. It became second nature, 2 passports in my wallet, a burner phone in every pocket, and a constant rotation of lies layered over lies. My first real assignment lasted 11 months. I lived in a rundown duplex in Portland, pretending to be a lab assistant while secretly gathering intel on a fentanyl ring operating out of a dog grooming business. I barely slept. I lost 15 pounds. My mom called once to ask if I needed money, and I told her I was trying out art school. She sounded disappointed but not surprised. That's the thing with being invisible. After a while, people stop asking. They accept the version of you that fits their narrative. For my family, I was the sister who never figured it out. The one who bounced between dead-end jobs, who couldn't hold down a relationship, who always missed holidays with vague excuses and last-minute cancellations. What they didn't know was that every absence had a reason. The Thanksgiving I supposedly spent in rehab, I was trapped in a basement with 3 other agents during a failed raid in Tijuana. The birthday I forgot to call, I was in a safe house with a cartel informant who'd just had his cover blown. I carried those lies like body armor, convinced that if I ever dropped the act, someone I loved would pay the price. Luke, my brother, was always the golden child. Harvard, tech startup, golf with investors. He didn't understand failure because he'd never tasted it. And in his eyes, I was a failure personified. Our parents fed into it too. Polite concern wrapped around cold indifference. They pitied me, maybe even resented me, but they never really questioned the story they'd built about who I was. I let them, because the alternative was explaining why I carried a gun to buy groceries. Why were my neighbors paid actors? I had a plan in place in case Luke's kids were ever used as leverage against me. There's no gentle way to say that. So I kept my mouth shut. I lived in apartments that smelled like mildew and kept my real life in a van with bulletproof glass. I watched birthday parties through security cameras and whispered happy birthday to my niece from 5 blocks away. And the whole time, they thought I was just too selfish to show up. I don't blame them, not entirely, but the day Luke called the cops on me, I realized something had changed. It wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was betrayal. And after 2 decades of silence, I was finally ready to speak. The officers kept asking Luke to slow down, but he wouldn't. He waved his arms like a stage actor, spinning a story that he'd clearly rehearsed. "She's been acting strange for months," he said, showing up at odd hours, mumbling to herself, never holding down a job. Then came the grand reveal. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small Ziploc bag with white powder. "I found this in her coat." "I mean, come on, what does that look like to you?" Officer Martinez stepped forward and took the bag, holding it up to the light like it might whisper the truth to him. I knew what it was: baking soda. I used it to scrub coffee stains out of the upholstery in my surveillance van. But in Luke's hands, under the weight of his credibility and clean image, it might as well have been heroin. That's the thing about power. It doesn't always come from truth. Sometimes it just comes from who people are used to believing. "Does she look like someone who's clean?" Luke asked, gesturing toward me like I was a broken appliance he'd finally decided to throw away. "She's 41 and lives in a 1-bedroom walk-up with peeling paint and no furniture. She's never contributed a dime to this family, and now she's turning to drugs. I tried to help her, but she won't let me." I sat there on the curb, wrists bound, mouth closed. Years of training told me not to speak. Let people talk long enough, and they'll show you who they really are. Luke was on a roll now. "This isn't about money," he said, though of course it was. "It's about safety. My kids live here. I can't have them around this kind of chaos." Officer Rodriguez looked unsure, glancing between me and her partner. I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Doubt, maybe. Sympathy. But it wasn't enough to stop the momentum building around Luke's words. I wasn't just a person anymore. I was a problem being solved in real time on a sidewalk I didn't belong to. Luke pulled out his phone and started showing photos. Me taking out trash in a hoodie. I walk alone down an alleyway. Me sleeping in my car during a stakeout. "This is who she is now," he said. "I've been documenting it. She's mentally unstable. She needs help before she hurts someone, or herself." Every word he spoke landed like a stone on my chest. I wanted to scream. To pull out the drive in my coat pocket that held enough evidence to put him away for decades. But that wasn't how this had to play out. Timing mattered. One wrong move, and the entire case I'd built would crumble before backup could arrive. Still, the weight of it all pressed down on me. Not just the accusation, but the ease with which he delivered it. Luke didn't flinch, not once. As if this version of me, the addict, the disgrace, was the only one he'd ever allowed himself to see. Or worse, the only one he wanted others to believe. Officer Martinez nodded slightly and muttered something into his radio. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt the shift, like the next decision would tip the scale either toward justice or disaster. And Luke stood there, polished watch catching the light, sure that he'd finally won. He didn't know who I really was, but he was about to find out. 6 months ago, Luke's name showed up in a routine DEA database scan. I didn't go looking for him. I was running an algorithm on flagged prescriptions tied to a pain management clinic in Phoenix. One of the doctors, Michael Carlson, had a prescribing pattern that didn't match any known medical protocol. His name was connected to a patient tracking software company based in San Diego, a company owned by none other than Luke Walker. That was my brother's startup. The one he bragged about at every holiday dinner. The one that revolutionized medical logistics. Only it wasn't logistics. It was laundering prescriptions through fake patient profiles across state lines. I followed the digital trail, IP addresses, server locations, payment routes that bounced through Wyoming, Nevada, and offshore accounts in the Caymans. It was meticulous, clinical. Whoever built it knew how to cover tracks, but not well enough to stay hidden from me. I'd spent my career hunting drug cartels who used orphanages as fronts. This was child's play in comparison. At first, I didn't want to believe it. I told myself Luke might not even know, that maybe someone in his company was using him. But the deeper I dug, the more his fingerprints showed up. His email approvals, his signature on shell company documents, texts with Carlson about boosting volume and accelerating demand. The same software that Luke said helped clinics manage patient flow was actually filtering for users most likely to get addicted. The end feeding that data back into doctors willing to write scripts for cash. It wasn't just unethical, it was murder by spreadsheet, and it had already led to over 200 overdose deaths in 3 states. The encrypted drive in my jacket held everything: emails, account statements, wire transfers, and recorded phone calls. Enough to shut down the entire operation and take half a dozen medical licenses with it. It also held proof that Luke had expanded the network into public school outreach programs, using fake educational partnerships to harvest minor patient data. That was the moment I stopped seeing him as my brother. I'd spent 20 years pretending to be less than I was so people like him could sleep at night. But he'd built an empire on addiction, on dead teenagers, on mothers who thought their kids were safe because the pills came from a pharmacy instead of a street dealer. I didn't hesitate after that. I filed my report, got it approved under codename Operation White Signal. I had one condition, that I stay on the case until the arrest. I wanted to be there, not for revenge, but because after everything I'd sacrificed, I needed to look him in the eye when the truth came out. And now here we were. He thought he was setting me up to fail, but every word he spoke, every smug gesture only sealed the case tighter. I wasn't the story he was telling the cops. I was the one who wrote the ending. Rodriguez stepped away from me, eyes fixed on the ID she'd just pulled from my coat pocket. She walked over to Martinez, whispered something, and showed him the credentials. His face tightened. Then he radioed something in a clipped, urgent tone I couldn't fully hear, but I caught the words federal agent and requesting supervisor. Luke was still talking, still spinning his web. He had no idea the air around him had shifted. I watched him check his watch again, like he had somewhere important to be, like this arrest of his sister was just a box to tick before brunch. Then 2 more patrol cars turned onto the street. Right behind them, a black SUV pulled up with tinted windows that only meant one thing. Luke finally paused. His voice faltered for the first time. The SUV door opened, and Special Agent Victoria Reyes stepped out. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't have to. I'd seen her wear that look before, the one reserved for takedowns that mattered. "Agent Walker," she said, walking up to me. "Are you injured?" I shook my head. Rodriguez cut the zip ties off my wrists. The moment the plastic fell away, something in me shifted, like I could finally breathe without having to lie. Reyes turned toward Luke. "Mr. Luke Walker," she said clearly, loudly, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, operating a criminal enterprise, and multiple counts of wire fraud and money laundering." Martinez moved behind him, already pulling out cuffs. Luke froze. For a second, I thought he might run, but then he laughed. A weak, confused sound, like he didn't believe any of this was real. "What are you talking about?" he said. She's not D. She's unemployed. She lives in government housing. His voice cracked. She doesn't even own a car. Reyes nodded toward me. She's been undercover for 2 decades, senior special agent, and you've been our target for the last 6 months. Luke's face collapsed. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked at me like he didn't recognize who I was. You're lying, he said. You can't be. You never did anything with your life. I stepped closer, just enough so he could hear me without anyone else needing to. That's what you were supposed to think, I said. That was the point. He didn't fight the cuffs. He didn't scream. He just stood there watching his entire world peel away in layers. All the money, the power, the image. None of it could save him from the truth he never saw coming. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care if he believed in me or not, because I knew exactly who I was, and now, so did everyone else. They gave us a few minutes before loading him into the transport vehicle. He was sitting on the edge of the curb, hands cuffed behind his back, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The Rolex was gone. His perfect hair was starting to come undone. He looked up at me like a child lost in a store aisle. Mia, he said, voice barely there. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know it was you. I nodded slowly. That's how it had to be. If you had known, you might not be alive right now. He blinked like he was trying to process the sentence, but couldn't find the beginning or end of it. I don't understand. You were always so lost. Mom and Dad said you'd never figure it out. They pitied you. I crouched beside him, staying just outside his reach. That was the point. I let them believe I was a failure so they wouldn't ask questions, so no one would ever use you to get to me. He shook his head. You protected me? His voice cracked on the last word. All those years? You were protecting me? I looked at him and didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because there was too much to say, and none of it would change anything. Yes, I said finally. Every missed holiday, every time I didn't show up, every rumor you helped spread to make me look unfit, I swallowed it all because if anyone ever suspected the truth, your name would be on a list. He exhaled sharply, like the weight of his own choices had just landed on his chest. I thought you hated us, he whispered. I thought you didn't care. My voice stayed calm, but there was an ache in it I couldn't hide. I gave up being your sister to keep you safe, and you repaid that by trying to get me arrested over an inheritance you didn't even need. He looked down, silent. The bravado was gone. The spin was done. What was left was just a man unraveling in front of the person he thought he'd already buried. I was wrong, he said. About you. About everything. I stood up. Yeah, you were. And with that, I turned away, not out of anger, but because some truths don't need to be explained anymore. Some people only see the light after they've burned everything else to the ground. I sat in my surveillance van, the same one that had doubled as my home more times than I could count. The seats still smelled faintly of old coffee and vinyl cleaner. Outside, the street was almost quiet again. The officers were gone. The neighbors had retreated behind curtains. Luke was in federal custody. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. Just saw the news. Please tell me you weren't involved. I stared at the screen for a moment before typing. I was involved. I'm the one who caught him. There was a pause. Then 3 dots. Then nothing. Then again 3 dots. Finally, she replied, What do you mean? You don't work in law enforcement. I could have ignored it. Could have kept the lie alive just a little longer. But I was done hiding. I typed slowly. I've been DEA for 20 years. Senior special agent. I couldn't tell you. It wasn't allowed. There was a long pause. I watched the sun dip lower behind the buildings, gold light stretching across the windshield like a promise. Then her reply came, short, quiet. Your father would have been so proud. I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, not vindication, just stillness. Like a door that had been locked for years, it finally creaked open, and nothing rushed out, because there was nothing left to prove anymore. For 2 decades, I lived in the shadows so others could stay safe in the light. I let them think I was broken so I could keep them whole. But today, the pretending ended. Today, I got to say out loud who I am. Not Aya the disappointment, not the family failure, just Mia Walker, DEA, and that's enough. I looked out at the sky again. The last light of Dresting gently rested across the rooftops. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like breathing for the first time in years. I wasn't undercover anymore. I wasn't running. I was just me, and that was finally okay.